The whole neighborhood laughed at him, and now they wish they hadn't. A broke, aging veteran in a red and black buffalo plaid jacket moved to the frozen edge of Duluth, Minnesota, hoping winter would finally give him peace. Instead of building a normal cabin, he dug into the hillside, burying his last savings beneath frozen earth. When the blizzard came, temperatures plunged below 40 degrees, and wooden houses began to fail one by one. But inside his underground shelter, it stayed warm. And when desperate neighbors followed his German shepherd's tracks through the snow, they discovered something no one believed was possible. What they found didn't just save lives, it forced an entire town to admit they were wrong. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. These stories travel farther than any storm ever could. Winter settled over Duluth like an old god who no longer needed to announce himself, wrapping the city in ice and breathing knives of wind off Lake Superior. Frank Walker lived where the plowed roads ended and the hills began in a strip of frozen land most people only noticed when driving past too fast. He was 72 years old, tall but bent slightly forward, as if his spine still remembered the weight of a rucksack that was no longer there. His face was sharply angled, weather-cut, with deep grooves running from nose to mouth, like permanent parentheses holding back words he no longer spoke. A gray beard clung stubbornly to his jaw, uneven and practical, trimmed not for appearance, but because it got in the way when he worked. Every morning without exception, Frank pulled on the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket. The fabric had softened with decades of wear, the elbows reinforced by hand-sewn patches, the collar frayed thin. It was the last thing he'd bought before leaving the service for good, and somehow it had outlasted marriages, friendships, and most of his faith in people. Beside him moved Rex, an aging German shepherd with a graying muzzle and a broad chest that still carried quiet authority. Rex was nearly 10 old for his breed, his once black coat now streaked with ash and silver along his back. One ear never fully stood upright anymore, a souvenir from a long-ago accident Frank never talked about. The dog's eyes, amber and alert, missed nothing. Rex walked not ahead of Frank, but slightly to the side, matching his pace, instinctively pausing when Frank paused, watching the world, with the patience of a creature who had learned that silence often mattered more than sound. Frank had come to Duluth after the VA doctor told him gently, and without looking up from the chart, that the noise in his head would probably never stop. Duluth had sounded like a place where noise froze before it could reach you. He bought the hillside property cheap, too cheap, people said, and ignored the way the real estate agent avoided his eyes when she handed him the keys. There was no house on the land, only an uneven slope crusted with frozen weeds and a shallow cut in the earth where someone long ago had abandoned a project. Frank saw something else entirely. He saw shelter. While his neighbors framed timber cabins with straight walls and pitched roofs meant to shed snow, Frank marked curves in the frozen soil. He measured not upward but inward carving lines that disappeared into the hillside. Day after day he dug. The work was slow, brutal, and unforgiving. The ground fought him with clay and stone, and the cold bit through his gloves until his fingers burned with a familiar, dangerous numbness. Frank welcomed the pain. Pain was honest. Pain didn't lie. People noticed. They always did. Across the way lived Mark Jensen, a man in his late 40s with a thick neck and the confidence of someone who had never been truly cold in his life. Mark worked maintenance for the city and prided himself on having built his own cabin with nothing but lumber nails and YouTube videos. He was broad-shouldered, perpetually red-faced with a laugh that carried even through wind. When he saw Frank digging down instead of building up, Mark laughed openly, hands shoved into his insulated vest. "You planning to bury yourself, old man?" he called once, not unkindly, just amused. Frank didn't answer. Rex lifted his head, stared at Mark until the laughter faltered, then returned his gaze to the earth. Others whispered. A retired schoolteacher named Elaine Morris, thin and stooped with snow-white hair tucked beneath knitted caps, shook her head whenever she passed. Men like that don't know when to stop, she told anyone who would listen. War breaks something permanent. Frank heard these things the way he heard wind through trees present, but not requiring response. At night, when the cold pressed hardest and the stars looked sharp enough to cut, Frank sat alone in his temporary trailer and reread a battered notebook. It wasn't a manual, not exactly. It was a collection of notes, sketches, and half-legible diagrams given to him years earlier by an old man he'd met overseas, a civilian contractor with hands like leather and stories older than any map Frank had carried. The man had talked about Earth the way others talked about religion, about how soil remembered heat, about how curved spaces didn't fight wind, they confused it. Frank hadn't understood it then. He did now. Rex slept at his feet, one paw twitching, as if running through dreams Frank suspected were calmer than his own. As weeks passed, the shape emerged. Bent wooden ribs arched inward, lashed together with rope. Straw was packed tight between layers, followed by heavy clay shoveled and pressed by hand. Frank moved with methodical precision, his breath forming clouds that drifted and vanished. His body remembered routines even when his mind resisted rest. Every decision felt like a negotiation between survival and memory. He wasn't building a home the way people expected. He was building something that didn't argue with winter. The first real snow came early, thick and wet, collapsing the laughter into silence. The temperature dropped hard after that, plunging at night, until metal screamed when touched. Frank felt the change in his bones before the radio confirmed it. Rex grew more alert, pacing the perimeter, nose lifted, tail low. Animals knew things weather forecasts didn't. One afternoon, as Frank hauled another load of earth toward the growing mound, a woman stopped at the edge of his property. Her name was Sarah Caldwell, though Frank wouldn't learn it until later. She was in her early 60s, tall and narrow, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun beneath her hood. Her face was pale, wind-reddened, the skin around her eyes finely lined from years spent squinting into glare off snow and water. She worked part-time at the public library and carried herself with the quiet restraint of someone who believed deeply in rules even when they failed her. "You know it's not safe," she said, not unkindly, her breath fogging between them. The ground freezes, structures shift. Frank rested on his shovel, studied her for a moment. "So do people," he replied, voice low, steady. Sarah frowned, unsure whether she'd been dismissed or understood. Rex stepped forward, standing between them, not aggressive, just present. Sarah nodded once and left boots crunching away. By December, the structure was nearly complete. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a swelling in the hillside, a lopsided hillock capped with snow. There were no windows, no visible roofline, just a heavy wooden door set at an angle, half hidden, its frame recessed deep enough to break the wind. Neighbors shook their heads harder now. They burned extra wood, sealed cracks, reinforced chimneys. Frank kept working quietly, finishing ventilation channels, testing airflow with a smoking wick, adjusting angles by inches. The night before the real cold arrived, Frank stood inside the finished shelter for the first time. The air felt different, still patient. Sound softened as if absorbed by the walls. Rex circled once, twice, then lay down with a sigh Frank felt in his chest. For the first time in years, Frank noticed the noise in his head fade to something manageable. Not silence, but close. Outside, the wind rose, howling down from the lake, with a force that rattled cabins and bent trees. Frank closed the door, sealed it carefully, and lit a small fire. The heat spread slowly, not in waves, but in layers. The earth accepted it without protest. Above them, winter gathered its strength. Below, a man and his dog waited unseen, unmocked, and finally unafraid. The people of Duluth didn't argue with Frank Walker's shelter anymore. They joked about it, and jokes were far crueler. By early December, the Earth Dome had become a landmark of mockery, a conversational shortcut used at diners and hardware stores whenever someone wanted to feel superior without trying very hard. "You seen the old vet's grave yet?" someone would say, stirring coffee. "Still digging," another would add, and the laughter followed easily, like breath in cold air. Frank heard none of it directly, but he felt it all the same. Contempt had a weight. It pressed down even through layers of soil and straw. He had learned long ago that ridicule was quieter than bullets, but lingered longer in the body. In war, mockery came after explosions when fear needed somewhere to go. Here it arrived unearned simply because he had chosen a different direction. The shelter grew heavier by the day. Frank hauled earth in measured loads, packing it carefully, never rushing. His movements were deliberate, economical, shaped by decades of habit. He did not swing tools. He placed them. The red and black flannel jacket was always visible, a moving square of color against white ground, as if he had no interest in hiding. Rex stayed close sometimes, lying at the mouth of the entrance, sometimes circling the perimeter with his nose low, tracking things Frank could not see. When the wind shifted suddenly, Rex would growl, not loud, just enough to register, and Frank would pause, waiting, listening with a soldier's patience. Mark Jensen made a sport of stopping by now. He never crossed onto Frank's land, but he stood close enough for his voice to carry. Mark was the kind of man who believed volume equaled truth. His beard was thick and reddish, trimmed into something aggressive, and his laugh always arrived before his words. "You know what they say about living underground," he called one afternoon, stamping his boots to keep warm. "That's where things rot." Mark's own cabin stood proudly behind him, timber walls, straight roof angled sharply upward, smoke pumping from the chimney, like proof of victory. Frank didn't look up. He tamped earth into place, his breath slow, controlled. Rex raised his head and fixed Mark with a stare that made the man's grin falter for half a second. "Easy, boy," Mark muttered, stepping back. He left soon after, laughter trailing behind him like exhaust. At night, when Frank's hands shook from cold and fatigue, memories crept closer. He remembered another kind of laughter, too loud, too fast, echoing through a concrete corridor, half a world away. Men laughing, because if they stopped, they'd have to listen to the distant thunder and acknowledge what it might mean. He remembered the bunker that had saved him, the way the walls held steady, while everything above seemed intent on tearing itself apart. That bunker had smelled of damp and oil and fear, but it had been solid, dependable. Frank trusted things that didn't promise comfort, only survival. Sarah Caldwell returned once, though she approached differently this time. She stood with her hands clasped inside her coat sleeves, posture straight, careful. Up close, her thinness was more pronounced, her height giving her a fragile elegance like a woman made of lines rather than curves. Her gray hair, pulled tight beneath her hat, framed a face that had learned restraint early. She didn't smile easily. "People are worried," she said, not accusing, not apologetic. "They think you're making a statement." Frank wiped his gloves on his jeans, considering her words. "I'm making a shelter," he replied. Sarah studied the structure, eyes tracing curves instead of corners. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "those are the same thing." She left without another word. Frank watched her go, wondering when practicality had become rebellion. The first real test came sooner than expected. A storm rolled in fast, not the kind announced days ahead on the radio, but a sudden tightening of air, a drop in pressure that made the world feel hollow. Snow fell sideways, stinging exposed skin, piling in drifts against structures that had not yet learned how to resist it. Frank was inside the dome when it hit, adjusting the ventilation channel, when Rex stiffened. The dog's ears flattened, his body angled toward the door. Frank closed the hatch and waited. Wind slammed into the hillside, howling, searching for purchase. Inside, the sound dulled, thickened, as if absorbed by the earth itself. Frank lit a small fire. The heat moved slowly, deliberately, like a promise that required patience. Across the clearing, Mark Jensen fought his cabin for hours. Snow packed against his walls, forcing its way into seams no amount of caulking could fully close. He fed his stove constantly, sweat freezing on his neck each time he stepped back. By morning, he was exhausted, angry, and colder than he would admit. When he looked toward Frank's hill and saw no smoke, no frantic movement, something unsettled shifted behind his eyes. He didn't go over. Pride was a heavier barrier than cold. Others noticed too. Elaine Morris slipped on ice outside her porch and sat there longer than she meant to, staring at the strange, quiet mound across the way. She had lived through enough winters to recognize patterns, and this one felt wrong. Dangerous. She wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered a small prayer she hadn't used in years. Frank slept better than he had in decades. The noise in his head receded as the storm raged, replaced by a steady, comforting pressure. Rex lay stretched beside him, chest rising and falling, the dog's warmth another layer of insulation. Frank dreamed not of war, but of silence without fear. The morning after, the sky cleared brutally, the kind of clarity that followed violence. The temperature dropped further cold, settling deep into bone and timber alike. Frank stepped outside, surveying the damage. Drifts piled high roofs, sagging chimneys, strained. He moved slowly, checking the dome's surface, brushing snow away from the door. Everything held. Mark Jensen emerged from his cabin looking smaller somehow. Shoulders hunched, beard rimmed with frost. He caught Frank's eye across the distance. For a moment, something like apology hovered between them. Then Mark looked away. By evening, rumors began to circulate, not laughter now, but uncertainty. People spoke of drafts that wouldn't stop, of fires that couldn't keep up. Frank heard snippets carried on the wind, fragments of fear. He felt no satisfaction. Only a tightening in his chest he recognized too well. The storm hadn't shown its full hand yet. Rex sensed it too, pacing more, pausing often to sniff the air. As darkness fell, Frank returned inside, sealing the door behind him. The shelter hummed with quiet stability. He sat on his makeshift bench, hands wrapped around a mug, watching the small fire glow. Above him, wind gathered strength again, preparing something worse. Frank leaned back against the earth wall, feeling its steady presence, and thought of all the times he'd trusted walls that couldn't keep their promises. This one felt different. Outside, laughter had finally stopped. What replaced it was far more dangerous. January arrived without drama, and that was how Frank Walker knew it would be deadly. The air over Duluth grew unnaturally still, thick and heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath. By dawn, the temperature had fallen to -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind coming off Lake Superior no longer sounded like weather. It screamed, it clawed, it hunted. Frank felt the change before the radio crackled with warnings. His joints tightened, an old familiar signal, the same sensation he'd felt years ago when silence fell just before incoming fire. Rex sensed it too. The dog's movements sharpened his pacing, more deliberate, his amber eyes tracking invisible shifts in pressure. He stopped sleeping deeply, rising at the slightest sound, nose lifted, tasting the air as if reading a language Frank only half understood. Outside, the wooden cabins began to fail in small, humiliating ways. Doors warped, window frames shrank and pulled away from their seals. Chimneys backdrafted, forcing smoke and ash back into living spaces. Fires burned hot and constant, but the heat bled out faster than it could be replaced. The cold didn't rush in all at once. It infiltrated patiently, threading itself through nail holes, knots in wood, microscopic gaps no one had ever bothered to see. Families layered clothing until movement became difficult. Children slept with hats pulled down over their ears. Breath turned to frost inside bedrooms. Mark Jensen discovered the first crack in his certainty on the second night of the storm. His cabin, built with pride and reinforced twice over, could not stay above freezing, no matter how much wood he fed into the stove. Mark was a man who measured his worth by what his hands could fix, and now his hands shook not from fear, he told himself, but exhaustion. His beard stiffened with ice each time he stepped outside to haul more logs. When his youngest daughter began to cry, because her fingers hurt, Mark snapped at her, then froze in shame. Anger had always been easier than admitting he didn't know what to do next. Across the clearing, Sarah Caldwell sat alone in her living room, wrapped in layers of wool that smelled faintly of mothballs and old books. Her house groaned as wind pressed against it, the walls flexing like ribs under strain. Sarah had lived her life by rules, codes of behavior, municipal guidelines, the quiet moral architecture of library order. She believed in systems because chaos frightened her. Now the system of wood and fire she had trusted all her life trembled. She watched the thermometer sink and felt something unfamiliar take hold, doubt. Frank remained underground. Inside the earth shelter, the world behaved differently. Sound arrived, muffled, softened, stripped of its sharp edges. The fire Frank lit was modest, controlled its heat, absorbed by the thick walls, and returned slowly, steadily. The temperature held near 20 degrees Celsius, barely shifting, even as the wind outside howled with renewed violence. Frank moved calmly, checking vents, adjusting dampers by millimeters, his hands steady. This was not defiance. It was cooperation with physics, with memory, with the land itself. Rex lay stretched on his side chest, rising and falling in deep, untroubled rhythm. Occasionally he lifted his head ears, angling toward distant sounds, then settled again, reassured. Frank watched him with quiet gratitude. The dog trusted this place completely. That mattered more than anything. By the third day, desperation crept through the neighborhood like a second storm. People ran out of dry wood. Furniture followed chairs, tables, shelves torn apart, and fed into stoves that could not keep up. The air filled with the smell of burning varnish and panic. Frostbite appeared not as a dramatic injury, but as a creeping numbness, fingertips, paling toes, losing sensation. Elaine Morris slipped again on her porch steps, this time hitting her hip hard enough to leave her gasping in pain. She dragged herself inside and sat shaking for an hour, too proud to call for help, too frightened not to. Frank heard none of the screams, but he felt the weight of what was coming. He sat on the bench he'd built along the curved wall, one hand resting against the earth, feeling the stored warmth like a heartbeat. Memories surfaced, uninvited faces, half seen in red light, men huddled together underground, waiting out a storm of a different kind. Survival had always depended on knowing when to stay put and when to open the door. The knock came just before nightfall on the fourth day. It was not loud. It was hesitant, uneven, the sound of someone conserving energy. Rex was on his feet, instantly alert, but not aggressive. Frank stood slowly, his body protesting, and approached the door. When he opened it, the wind tried to force its way in, but the angled entry broke its charge. Mark Jensen stood there, barely recognizable. His shoulders sagged, his face gray beneath frostbitten skin, beard clumped with ice. Behind him, his wife and two children clung together, eyes wide, lips blue. Mark did not laugh. He did not speak at first. He simply looked past Frank into the shelter where warmth glowed softly, where the air did not burn the lungs. When he finally found his voice, it cracked. "I was wrong," he said, "and for Mark Jensen, that admission cost more than any storm ever could." Frank stepped aside. "Come in," he said, as if the words weighed nothing at all. They stumbled inside, steam rising from their clothes as heat met frozen fabric. The children began to cry, not from fear this time, but relief. Rex approached them carefully, tail low, then sat a solid presence anchoring the chaos. Mark sank onto the bench, burying his face in his hands. He did not look up again for a long time. Word spread quickly after that, carried not by gossip, but necessity. Sarah Caldwell arrived next, her posture still upright, but her face drawn skin pale against the dark wool of her coat. Her gray hair had escaped its bun strands plastered to her temples with sweat and melting frost. She took in the shelter with wide, analytical eyes, cataloging every detail even as her hands trembled. "This shouldn't work," she whispered, not accusing, simply stunned. Frank handed her a mug and said nothing. By midnight, others followed Elaine Morris, limping but alive. A young couple from 2 houses down, faces hollow with exhaustion. A man Frank barely knew, his beard rimmed, white eyes darting. The shelter filled with bodies and breath, with whispered prayers and quiet sobs. Yet the temperature barely dropped. The walls absorbed it all, heat, sound, fear, and held. Frank moved among them with a steadiness that surprised even himself. He directed people to sit, to drink, to breathe. He explained nothing unless asked. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You saved us," she said. Frank shook his head. "The ground did," he replied. Outside, the storm reached its peak, tearing through Duluth with merciless precision. Inside the earth, people survived. And somewhere deep within the hillside, winter met something it could not break. The knocking did not stop after Mark Jensen and his family came inside. It changed instead, grew softer, more careful, as if the people outside had learned that sound itself was something to ration. Each knock carried hesitation, pride stripped down to necessity. Frank Walker heard them all, even when the wind tried to swallow the noise. He stood near the door, his tall frame silhouetted by firelight, the red and black flannel jacket darkened with melted snow. For a moment, he felt the old weight return, the one that came whenever survival stopped being personal and became shared. The next to arrive was Thomas Reed, a man Frank barely knew beyond passing nods. Thomas was in his early 50s, lean to the point of sharpness, with a narrow face and hollowed cheeks that made his eyes look too large. He worked seasonal dock jobs when the lake allowed it, carrying crates, until his hands split, then wrapping them in tape and doing it again. Years of instability had taught him not to trust kindness, and it showed in the way he hovered at the threshold, unwilling to step fully inside until Frank nodded once. Thomas's beard was patchy, frost stiffened his breath coming in shallow bursts. He entered without a word, choosing a place against the wall, knees drawn up. Eyes never leaving the door, as if expecting to be chased back into the cold. More followed. A young mother named Emily Carter arrived carrying an infant bundled so tightly only a red nose showed. Emily was barely 30, small-framed with pale blonde hair plastered to her face, eyes rimmed raw from tears and wind. Her husband had stayed behind to tend a failing stove, convinced he could still fix it. Emily's hands shook violently as Frank guided her to the warmest section of the wall. Rex approached slowly, sniffed the baby, then lay down beside them, his body pressed close enough to share heat without crowding. Emily sobbed into her sleeve, the sound quiet but unstoppable. Sarah Caldwell moved through the growing crowd with a composure that surprised even her. She had shed her rigid posture somewhere between her failing house and Frank's door. Her tall, slender frame bent slightly, now gray hair, fully loose strands, curling with moisture at her neck. She spoke softly, organizing people by instinct rather than authority, offering blankets, encouraging small sips of water. Rules still mattered to Sarah, but tonight survival rewrote them. She caught Frank's eye once and nodded a wordless acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. The shelter filled until there was barely space to move. Bodies pressed close, breath thickening the air. Frank adjusted the vents carefully, aware that warmth without air was another kind of danger. The channels worked as he had designed them, cool air drawn low, warmed gradually, stale air rising and escaping without stealing heat. The walls absorbed everything, sound, warmth, fear. The temperature dipped only slightly, holding steady in a way that felt almost defiant. Outside, Duluth suffered. The storm intensified through the night wind screaming across frozen ground, tearing shingles free, collapsing poorly braced porches. Somewhere in the distance, a tree split with a sound like a gunshot. Frank flinched despite himself. Rex's ears twitched, but the dog remained calm, a steady presence amid the chaos. He moved occasionally, repositioning himself beside children or the elderly, his instincts guiding him toward those who needed the most warmth. As hours passed, something subtle changed among the people inside. Panic softened into exhaustion. Exhaustion into fragile trust. Conversations began in murmurs, apologies offered without being asked, for confessions whispered into the dim. Mark Jensen spoke once, voice rough, admitting he had laughed because he was afraid of looking foolish if Frank was right. Thomas Reed listened, arms wrapped around his knees, and nodded as if this explanation matched something he'd always suspected about people. Near dawn, Emily's baby began to whimper, the sound thin and alarming. Sarah knelt beside her fingers, checking tiny hands, face tightening. "She's cold," Emily whispered, terror flaring again. Frank crouched, feeling the infant's skin, calculating silently. He guided them closer to the wall, repositioned the fire, slightly adjusted the vent by a fraction. Rex pressed his flank against Emily's legs. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the baby's cries softened. Sarah exhaled shakily, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "This place," she said quietly, "shouldn't exist." Frank didn't answer. He was too busy listening to the walls. By morning, the storm showed no sign of relenting. The radio crackling faintly through interference confirmed what everyone already felt: this was not a normal winter event. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Power lines were down. Travel was impossible. Frank realized then that opening the door once meant it would not close again, not until the storm broke or the shelter failed. He accepted this without resentment. He had built the dome for survival. Survival, it turned out, was communal. Another knock came weaker than the others. Frank opened the door to reveal Mark Jensen's wife, Claire, returning alone. Claire was a thin woman with dark hair, cut short for practicality, her face lined with worry rather than age. She had gone back to check on neighbors who hadn't answered calls. "2 houses down," she said, voice hoarse. "They didn't make it." No one asked who. The answer hung heavy in the air. Silence followed, thick and reverent. Even the children sensed it. Frank closed the door gently. The shelter held. That night, no one in the dome froze to death. Not the elderly, not the children, not the infant pressed against the earth's steady warmth. Outside, the storm raged, indifferent to human suffering. Inside, something quieter and more powerful took root, the understanding that survival was not about pride or tradition, or who had laughed loudest. It was about listening, truly listening to what worked. Frank sat against the wall as dawn crept faintly through the vents, eyes closed, Rex's head resting on his boot. For the first time in years, he felt neither anger nor grief, only a profound, weary clarity. He had opened the door because that was what the shelter was for, because some walls were meant not to separate, but to hold. Above them, the hill endured, and beneath it a town learned what warmth really meant. Spring did not arrive suddenly in Duluth. It crept in cautious and apologetic, as if unsure it would be forgiven. Snowbanks receded inch by inch, revealing warped porches, collapsed roofs, and timber walls split open like old scars. The storm had passed, but it left behind something heavier than damage, a truth no one could comfortably deny anymore. Wood had failed, pride had failed faster, and the earth patient and silent had endured. Frank Walker watched the thaw from the edge of his hill hands, buried deep in the pockets of his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket. The fabric was faded now, softer than ever, the cuffs frayed thin, but it still hung on his tall, angular frame like a second skin. Winter had etched itself deeper into his face, creased lines around his eyes, a permanent set to his jaw. But there was something lighter in his posture, a subtle easing he hadn't felt in years. Rex sat beside him, older still, his muzzle nearly white now, thick tail resting across Frank's boot. The dog's movements were slower measured, but his eyes remained sharp, following the world with the calm confidence of a survivor. Frank did not attend the town meetings that followed. He didn't stand in front of anyone to explain what he had done or why it worked. He didn't correct the rumors that grew around the shelter stories that exaggerated, softened, or mythologized what had happened beneath the hill. Frank had learned long ago that explanations invited arguments, and arguments invited ego. He had not built the earth shelter to teach anyone a lesson. He had built it because he remembered something the world had forgotten. Sarah Caldwell attended every meeting. She sat straight-backed in folding chairs, her tall, slender figure wrapped in sensible coats, gray hair now worn loose more often than not. The storm had altered her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Her skin looked thinner, more translucent, as if winter had peeled away an outer layer of certainty. Sarah listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was carefully, deliberately. She no longer framed her thoughts around rules or codes. She spoke about outcomes, about lives saved, about systems that worked because they adapted, not because they were traditional. Mark Jensen was quieter now, too. The storm had taken something from him that no amount of rebuilding could replace, his belief that effort alone guaranteed success. His beard was trimmed shorter these days, his laugh rare and restrained. He spent most mornings tearing apart sections of his old cabin, salvaging what he could, discarding the rest. When he spoke to Frank, which happened only occasionally, it was with a humility that still felt foreign on his tongue. "You didn't owe us anything," he said once, standing awkwardly near the hill. Frank shrugged. "The ground didn't care who needed it," he replied. Change came slowly then, all at once. The first new structure appeared at the edge of town in early summer, half buried into a slope that had once been considered useless land. It belonged to Thomas Reed, the dock worker, whose sharp-edged caution had softened into something steadier after the storm. Thomas worked quietly, methodically. His lean frame, bent over shovels and Timber's beard, now kept neat eyes clearer. He had studied Frank's shelter from a distance, asked careful questions, listened more than he spoke. When people scoffed, Thomas didn't argue. He just kept building. Others followed. By autumn, Duluth looked subtly different. The change wasn't dramatic, no grand declarations, no sweeping architectural revolutions, but it was unmistakable. Hillsides bore new shapes. Curved walls emerged where straight ones once dominated. Entryways angled away from prevailing winds. Earth appeared not as something to conquer or clear away, but something to work with. People stopped calling Frank's shelter a grave. They began calling it a refuge. Frank remained on his hill. He repaired what winter had worn down, reinforcing beams, repacking soil, adjusting drainage. His movements were slower now, joints protesting more loudly. But Rex stayed close, offering silent encouragement. The dog's age showed in the way he rose, carefully, stretched, longer, slept deeper. Frank adapted instinctively, building small ramps, lowering thresholds, making space for Rex's changing body without ever acknowledging it aloud. One afternoon, Sarah Caldwell climbed the hill alone. She moved carefully, boots sinking into softening ground, breath measured. When she reached Frank, she stopped, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "They're calling it a model now," she said, nodding toward the town. "Your shelter. The council wants to document it." Frank snorted softly. "The ground doesn't need documentation," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "People do." They stood in silence for a while, watching clouds drift where storms once roared. Sarah spoke again, quieter this time. "I spent my life believing that order kept people safe," she said. "Turns out it's flexibility." Frank nodded. He understood that kind of reckoning. "Earth's flexible," he replied. "That's why it lasts." Winter returned the following year, as it always did, but it came humbler. The cold was sharp, but not cruel. Snow fell steadily, predictably. This time fires burned less desperately. Houses held warmth longer. People slept through the night without fear. Frank watched from his shelter as lights glowed across the hills, steady and calm. He never became a hero. No plaques bore his name. No interviews sought his story. When visitors asked to see the shelter, Frank allowed it, quietly answering questions when asked, redirecting praise when offered. He spoke of soil density, of curves, of patience. He never spoke of the war. He never spoke of the nights underground that had taught him what mattered. Rex aged gracefully. His steps grew shorter, his hearing dulled, but his presence remained constant. On cold evenings, he lay against the earth wall, eyes half closed, content. Frank sat nearby, one hand resting on the dog's broad back, feeling the slow rhythm of breath and the steady warmth of the hill. People still built houses above ground in Duluth. Not everyone learned the same lesson, and Frank never expected them to. But now, when winter whispered its warnings, there were other options, other ways to survive. Frank Walker did not change the town by proving anyone wrong. He changed it by remembering what worked, by trusting the earth, by opening a door when it mattered. And when the snow fell again, settling softly over curved roofs and quiet hills, the town endured, not because it had defeated winter, but because it had finally learned how to live with it. Sometimes God does not answer with thunder or fire. Sometimes he answers with patience, with soil, with wisdom passed quietly from one generation to another. Frank Walker did not defeat winter. He listened to the earth God created, to the lessons written into nature, long before we learned to argue with it. And in that listening, lives were saved. Maybe the miracle was not the shelter itself. Maybe the miracle was that when pride finally froze, compassion opened a door. In our own lives, storms come in many forms: illness, loneliness, fear, loss. And we often try to fight them head-on, burning ourselves out, wondering why strength alone is not enough. But sometimes God invites us to do something different, to slow down, to lean into what is steady, to trust that shelter can come from unexpected places, faith, kindness, community, or a simple act of humility. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on where you might need to stop fighting the storm and start seeking shelter. And if you believe someone else needs this reminder, please share this story with them. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what storm you've survived or are still walking through. Your words may be the shelter someone else needs tonight. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, so you don't miss stories that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you, keep you warm through every season, and guide you gently just as He guided a man, a dog, and a quiet hill when it mattered most. Amen.